Hello and welcome to our first major lecture of our course 303, British Literature. In this week's lesson, we'll frame some of the major issues that will recur during our studies, and we'll introduce our first unit, the British Restoration, the English Restoration, I should say. I'll make sense of all these details of history, English and British, what it is that we're talking about, as well as how it relates to the literature of the time. You can see down below a kind of timeline of the politics of this era. We'll need to refer to it a fair amount, and some slides that help guide us through the readings that will appear in the large square next to me. Now, when you last were studying English literature, probably last semester in 206 Renaissance Literature with Professor Kalkbrenner, you'll recall that you ended your studies with Paradise Lost, a magnum opus masterpiece by John Milton, the canonical late Renaissance English writer. Now, you studied Paradise Lost with an emphasis on the poetics of the poem. I'll refer you to this wonderful and insightful video made some time ago by Professor Kalkbrenner that goes over these key concerns of the epic poem by Milton: its classicism, its interests in Greek and Roman influences versus its Christian and points of interest, as well as some of the major literary and theological preoccupations of the text. But while you studied it, and I think it was right to do so, with emphasis on the poetics of that text, for our purposes, we'll need to take up the politics of not just Milton's Paradise Lost, but his other late masterpieces, such as Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes, all texts that were actually written not only after Milton went blind, but also after the British monarchy was restored, giving the name to the Restoration. Now, you discussed, and we all talked about, the canonical status of Milton, how he serves as this figure with whom all subsequent English authors must wrestle, such as William Blake. Here is Blake's cover in his own art, his own engraving of Milton. You can see the letters going around that head, Milton, as it says on the side, a poem that William Blake, a poet with whom we'll reach later this term, a romantic at the end of the 18th century. They're all taking up this figure of Milton, and even the opening passages of Milton, the preface to this text, this homage to Milton, as you can see here, called Jerusalem, apropos for us, also not only lionize Milton as the entire poem does, the entire epic, the entire text does, but this particular preface, as we can take a look at, becomes a kind of an encomium, a celebration, not just of Milton as this voice of England, but also of England's elect status, its chosen status as a special country, a chosen nation. Let's read this text, even though it's not from the Restoration, because it will serve our purposes, as you'll see in just a minute. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pasture seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among those dark satanic mills? Now, we'll get back to the end of this. We'll get back to the references behind this piece written in the 1790s, why Blake is talking about Milton and satanic mills. But let's just look at these last few lines of this preface to Milton, again from this brief excerpt that has been come to called Jerusalem because of these last few lines. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. This has become a kind of anthem of England, an unofficial one. It refers to, in brief, one thing you do have to know is, for now, is that it refers to a myth that during the missing years of Jesus's life, before he takes up his Galilean ministry, between the period when he was a young man and when he becomes back and appears on the scene as a leader, that he may have traveled to, in fact, England, and there is this unique bond between those feet that may have tread on England's green, the Lamb of God being Jesus, and England as a new promised land. We can note the significance of this poem in contemporary England. Here is the traditional singing of the poem Jerusalem at the end of what's called the Prom, a summer BBC music production. Here it is from 2018, and just notice the patriotism, the pride behind this poem. Milton, Jerusalem, Blake writing, and here it is in 2018. Okay, let's pause it here. Now, it could be a bit ironic for those of us, I happen to be in the city of Jerusalem speaking to you, to think about how this text takes a tradition of English poetry, an homage, it's the preface to Milton, written by another English poet who is taking up the legacy of this poet that he venerates, Milton, this figure that he venerates, and writing a kind of text that talks about building Jerusalem in England, and here it is in London. You could see the patriotism. You can see a kind of restoration, not just of in the sense that we're going to be talking about today, but kind of claim to an English classical legacy. Now, the reason that I think it's important to go back and think about, and I know it's confusing, to think about all these various voices, all these different times, is because we can lose sense when we study Milton, when we think of the trajectory of English literature, that we know how it will end. That England becomes this great power with a very rich history, a kind of pride and Englishness that today, in our generation, the 2020s of the mid-21st century, is both sterling and a bit aged. It's something from times bygone. We almost feel that we know how this story will end. Putting Milton as this key figure of English literature, as someone with whom all the authors must wrestle and contend, who structures alongside Shakespeare these sort of these two stars, these two poles of English literature, an idea of it almost makes it seem like there's going to be an ascent of English culture that will spread around the world. As I've said in one of my already earlier prefatory videos, we need to be wary of that account. For when Milton wrote Paradise Lost, And we'll take a look at one of the passages in just a second. He was impoverished. He was threatened. He was imperiled politically. His freedom was. His very vision, his conception of what England ought to be, was in shambles. And England itself was going through dire straits. The promise of England as the superpower that in fact it became over the 18th century into the 19th century was hardly assured. We need to read the texts that we are going to be taking up over the next few weeks in these lessons in the context of their time, with contingency, meaning not putting the end before the beginning, not knowing how it will turn out in the end, since these authors did not. We need to look at them on their own terms. And that can also offer the most relevant and pertinent lesson to us in reading these texts. As I've said, understanding why we are reading these texts would be the same answer of why England has become the dominant language in business science, popular culture, and so on. But this was hardly foretold when we start our course in 1660. In fact, if we are to go back to this time, it was as likely that England would become a republic, a democracy, as it was become an absolute monarchy, or the constitutional monarchy that in fact became and still is. It might have become a superpower, as it became for a very long time, about 200 years, as it could have become a failed state, fractured into its various pieces. Let's not take what we know to be the case, our historical understanding, and privilege that over our interpretation of the texts that lie ahead of us. For the Restoration is all about creating the society that England was to become without any prejudice of the direction that it ultimately took. It is in this mid-17th century period, the middle decades even unto the late decades, that the shape of English society began to form, in which all these questions are open. And while we're going to be reading the literature, we're also going to take a detour next week into political philosophy to wrestle with the questions of what should this society look like? What ought its political arrangements be? What kind of civilization is it? How is society ordered? Those key questions are some of the most essential parts of the Restoration's posterity. When all was being wrestled with, all was being debated, and no outcome was assured. Okay, and now to our first reading. In some weeks, and in many lessons, I'll ask you to take a pause and to read the texts on your own time, and you can pace yourself. Because this is our first week, I'll guide you through the readings myself. Here is the final book of Paradise Lost. In this book, book 12, as you can see, the archangel Michael is guiding Adam and Eve out of the garden, out of Eden, following the fall. Now, the beginning of this book, this final book from what is the 1674 version of Paradise Lost, it was published in two waves, 1667 and in 10 books, and then 1674 in 12 books, begins as follows. As one who in his journey baits at noon, though bent on speed, so here the archangel paused, betwixt the world destroyed and world restored. If Adam aught perhaps might interpose, then with transition sweet new speech resumes. Thus thou hast seen one world begin and end, and man as from a second stock proceed. Much thou hast yet to see, but I perceive thy mortal sight to fail. Objects divine must needs impair and weary human sense. Henceforth what is to come I will relate. This is a text about how the end has already come for this pair, for Adam and Eve, in some ways for mankind, with the fall and the original sin. Here, the end of Book 12 in some ways reflects the very beginning of Book 1 of Paradise Lost, in which death, the suffering, the end is already foretold. The end has come, and yet a new beginning is at hand. Notice these key words, such as in line 3, betwixt, the world destroyed and the world restored. If Adam Autumn, perhaps, might interpose, what comes in between this world destroyed and world restored? And when he uses this word restored, we have to bear in mind when he is writing this. He's writing this text in the years, the decade and a half, following the restoration and the failure, the destruction of the Commonwealth, the Republic to which Milton had given so much of his energy, his intellect, and almost his life. He nearly was sentenced to death for his activities as a leader of the Commonwealth and of the Civil War. He, Milton, has seen one world begin and end, and there is a reading, a very valid reading of Paradise Lost as a kind of lament, a way of mourning, an elegy for the loss of what's sometimes called the good old cause, the lost Civil War. And here let's talk a bit about what that history is. Now, I know it's confusing. Let's simplify matters. The English Civil War, as you can see on this timeline down below, occurred in a few waves over the course of about a decade, starting in the 1640s when the English Civil War broke out with the Royalists, sometimes called the Cavaliers, versus the Parliamentarians, Republican forces called sometimes the Roundheads. The Republicans, the Parliamentarians, people supporting Parliament, actually won temporarily. The issues were myriad. They were, in some sense, the creeping absolute rule of the monarch, Charles I, as well as was always the case in the 17th century, religious friction between different factions of Christianity, primarily Catholicism and Protestantism, which led to extraordinary bloodletting in Europe, the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648. In England, there's an offshoot in which the Anglican, the established official Church of England, the Anglican Church, then the Catholic Church, the continent-wide, primarily in Europe, of course, at this time, European official religion with its base in Rome, versus various Protestant dissenting churches. The parliamentarians are primarily Protestant, in fact, even led by some Puritans, very zealous form of Protestantism. And the king, Charles I, suspends parliaments. He will not listen to them. This is what sparks the Civil War. Under the leadership of Thomas Cromwell, the parliamentarians win. They, in fact, arrest, try, and execute. In fact, they kill the king in an act of what's called regicide, killing the the king, and establish over the course of over a little more than a decade first the Commonwealth of England, kind of a democracy, then what's called the Protectorate of Thomas Cromwell, the English Republic. All this can also be known by the interregnum, the period between regencies, the period between kings. It collapses. Thomas Cromwell dies in 1658. His son Richard is not the leader that Thomas Cromwell was. It splits into various factions. The Protectorate, the Commonwealth does. And in 1660, the English monarch is brought back. It is the son of Charles I, King Charles II, a very different kind of character, very libertine individual, given to drama, given to sex, given to all kinds of pleasures, and also very he develops a persona, a very cheerful figure. Now we'll look at some of these texts of restoration in a moment, But let's also just bear in mind that there is a way to read these texts by Milton as mourning this lost, this destroyed cause, the world restored, and a new beginning. Can there be hope for his cause even after all seems lost? Here is Samson Agonistes, Milton's final major work. And in this text, there's a passage in which compares the story of Samson, the biblical figure, once he is apprehended by the enemies, the Philistines, people given to lust. Philistine is a term that in our world, in our day, has come to mean people given to pleasure, something that Milton mourned among England, that had the Restoration culture that had taken hold. And he writes, or to the unjust tribunals under change of times, and condemnation of the ingrateful multitude, if these they escape, perhaps in poverty, with sickness and disease, thou bowest them down, painful diseases and deformed and crude old age. Now, he's talking about a specific incident, a specific stage of the Samson story, in which Samson, this belittled, debased champion of the Jews, is given power by God to bring down the house and bring destruction upon all the Philistines. But what exactly might a subtext be of this? The unjust tribunals, the many trials of the Restoration, ultimately there was a blanket amnesty. That is how Milton survived. He was given a pardon, along with many others, even after having to go into hiding at the very beginning of the Restoration. The change of times, the condemnation of the ingrateful multitude, people welcomed King Charles II back, the return of the king. After what was seen to be as the anarchy and the chaos of the late Commonwealth, people were welcoming the return of the monarchy. Milton himself, however, lived in poverty. He lived with sickness, disease. No one's actually sure what brought about his blindness, perhaps glaucoma. Deformed, crude old age as he felt himself approaching, a kind of thankless and humiliated old age. Perhaps he is talking also about his own state. This, of course, was not the mood taken by some of the Restoration writers, the royalists, who welcomed the return of the king. Foremost among these voices is someone called John Dryden. John Dryden, in some ways, is the poet of the Restoration. We're going to look at two texts of his, Annus, Mirabilis, and one other. But what I want to play for you, what I wanted to read with you first, actually, is another text of his. An epigram on Milton, written in 1688, some 14 years after Milton's death in 1674. This very brief text, the epigram on Milton, is already an early indication of that kind of lionization, celebration of Milton that I mentioned earlier. Dryden, this herald of restoration, this voice celebrating the monarchy and the mood of the times, nonetheless writes about Milton with extraordinary veneration and appreciation. 3 poets in 3 distant ages born, Greece, Italy, and England did adorn. The first in loftiness of thought surpassed, the next in majesty, in both the last. The force of nature could no farther go, to make a third she joined the former two. He's talking of the 3 great poets of literary tradition. 2 in all born in different ages, vast ages separate them, 3 distant ages born. The first was born in Greece. He's talking, of course, about Homer. The second in Italy, one adorned with majesty, that's Virgil. And then the third great poet of the classical tradition that Dryden here embraces is Milton, who combines Virgil and Homer. In both the last, Milton features both majesty and loftiness of thought. Nature can go no farther than Milton. To make a third, she joined the former two. Of course, Dryden not only is celebrating Milton, but in some ways, of course, is comparing himself, is competing with Milton. And he has very, very different coordinates. In this text by Dryden, he writes about when our great monarch into exile went, wit and religion suffered banishment. Thus once when Troy was wrapped in fire and smoke, the helpless gods forsook. The helpless gods their burning shrines forsook. They with the vanquished prince and party go, and leave their temples empty to the foe. At length the muses stand restored again to that great charge which nature did ordain. And their loved druids seem revived by fate, while you dispense the laws and guide the state. The nation's soul our monarch does dispense, through you to us his vital influence. Dryden here is, of course, celebrating not the Commonwealth. He's not mourning the good old cause. He is embracing the return of our great monarch and the cultural consequences of the interregnum, the monarch's exile, when our great monarch went into exile wit and religion suffered banishment. There was no great wit, pleasing thought, or religion. He also compares it, just as he compares Milton to Homer and Virgil, he too compares London without its king, Commonwealth England, to Troy wrapped in fire and smoke, to ruined Troy. And then, of course, at length the muses stand, restored again, that word, restored. Not just is the monarchy brought back, but good taste, culture, the muses, poetic inspiration, and literature. And of course, it all owes itself to that nation's soul, our monarch, the vital influence, the channel, the lifeblood of the people. He's overdoing it here. It's panegyric. He is bowing down. It is a celebration of the king. There's of course a great deal more of this ilk. This poem is not all that significant. I just want to mention this restoration theme. What is more significant, however, and this is one of the main points I want to bring up with you today, is Annus Mirabilis. You can see the title down below. Annus Mirabilis is a poem from the middle of this Restoration period, 1666. The full name, Annus Mirabilis, Year of Wonders, and we'll look at let's look at an early printing of it here. It is a text, Annus Mirabilis means Year of Wonders, 1666. It is a poem, as you can see here, and you can read it on your own time, written by Dryden, in which Dryden talks about the events of this crucial year. Now, what happened in this year, 1666? You can see it actually was published in 1667. Let's look at the front of it. Its frontispiece on its printing cover. It is an historical poem. It is a poem unlike any other that you've read in some time. It's referring to specific actual events. As you can see here, the progress and various successes of our naval war with Holland. So it's celebrating a naval victory under the conduct of his High Prince, Rupert, and His Grace, the Duke of Albemarle, and describing the fire of London. Two main topics in this text, written, as you can see, by John Dryden, and yes, here on the bottom, 1667. What fire? The 1660s, this decade following Restoration, were hardly a cakewalk. They were not a smooth period. In fact, the unrest of the previous few decades, the political unrest, gave way to extraordinary new tribulation, new struggles in England. As you can see here on the timeline down below, the Restoration in 1660 was followed soon thereafter by plague, the worst pandemic England had seen in a very long time, and actually has not seen since then until our era. The pandemics of 1918, 1919, and of 2020, 2021. The plague of London was horrific. An extraordinary share of London, which was by then actually Europe's largest city, a teeming place of 500,000 people, in which the losses were simply devastating. We'll talk more about it. 1 year later, or actually the same year, because the plague lasted from 1665 to 1666, a fire tore through the heart of the city of London, what was called the original Roman walled city, destroying about 3/4 of medieval, traditional London, and displacing many. The loss of life was actually not that terrible, since it was a slow-moving fire. It lasted over the course of about a week. It wasn't all just in one night, but it was also completely devastating. There was a sense that the political unrest of recent memory, this inexplicable to them, a natural disaster, the plague that brought death everywhere, and then the utter destruction of the heart of England, London, were trials that perhaps would set England back. And when I say England was in dire straits at the time when Milton was writing Paradise Lost, which is exactly these years, that's what I mean. It is not assured what will happen to England. These challenges are extraordinary. Yes, there's also the victory over Holland, which is something else that hopefully I'll have a chance to discuss a bit. But these are extraordinary events that shake English society to the core. The Great Plague and the Great Fire of London. What does Dryden call it, however? Annus Mirabilis, the year of wonders. He talks about the resilience of England, its ability to come back from these challenges. As he writes here, now streets, and remember that this symbol here that looks kind of like an F is an S in traditional and older British English printing. Now streets grow thronged and busy as by day. Some run for buckets to the hallowed choir. Some cut the pipes and form the engine's play. And some more bold mount ladders to the fire. He's describing the response to this horrible fire, as you can see here, an engraving of the time. These attempts to try to put it out, and there was quite a bit of mismanagement. Methinks already from this chemic flame I see a city of more precious mold, rich as the town which gives the Indies name, with silver paved and all divine with gold. Already laboring with a mighty fate, she shakes the rubbish from her mounting brow, and seems to have renewed her charter's date, which heaven will to the death of time allow. He sees in the destruction, Dryden does, in the ashes of the fire, a new London coming to be. This whole poem, Annus Mirabilis, a rather long poem, I've linked to it. You can read more of it if you wish. Here we are just excerpting from it. Here you can see another passage of the same. Yet London, empress of the northern Clyde, by an high fate that greatly didst expire, great as the world which at the death of time must fall and rise a nobler frame by fire. He's talking about the reincarnation, almost the rising up. It's almost a Christian redemptive account. The reincarnation of this city under in new life. He's seeing some symbolic significance in these events. in the restoration, in the return, in the rising up out of the ashes, as when some dire usurper heaven provides to scourge his country with a lawless sway, his birth perhaps some petty village hides and sets his cradle out of fortune's way. The same issue of a new life, what happens after destruction, a new beginning that Milton had talked about at the end of Paradise Lost, here is being sketched in very similar terms, actually even before he's read Paradise Lost. Dryden's writing this at exactly the same time that Milton is putting the final touches on his first version of it, 10-book version of it. But they're trafficking in the same ideas of what kind of society will rise up out of the political unrest, out of the plague, pandemic, and out of natural, what's seeming to them, natural destruction, this fire, utter wanton destruction. These are, of course, challenges that we're very familiar with in our day. What does our future society look like on the backs of civil unrest, political uncertainty, great debates about what politics should look like, on the heels of pandemic, and of course wrestling with fire and destruction of habitat, of our lived quarters. These questions are being debated by all these figures. By Milton, the canonical figure, by the person who sees himself as Milton's successor, John Dryden, who writes also, of course, in very fixed terms, but far more attempting to be pleasing, less sober, less, obviously not the same theology, but writing in a kind of very decorous, decorum way, where you can see, as you can see here, all of the perfectly rhymed and end-stopped lines, every word attempting to be in the right place, as one would say of the time. And Dryden said of himself, a writer of great wit, but nonetheless animating, driving. The energy behind these figures is what will England be like? What does English society look like in this second attempt? Not just the second, but to them it's a new attempt, a revived attempt. The phoenix will rise up. The silver society that he sees in the future. He's optimistic about what will follow. Of course, he is on the side of the powerful. He is allied with the king. He is a member of the court. Okay, let's take a little break, and then we'll carry on with Samuel Pepys.